the work that we did together dealt with internal and international migration and trying to see which is the link between the two. Mostly what we know about internal migration in Egypt is that it's very, very low for the region. And it's actually quite interesting to see that Egypt has one of the lowest migration rates in the world, especially when we compare it to other countries in the region who have internal migration rates of around 15%. The last estimates before the ELMPS showed a migration rate of around 8%. Conversely, on the international migration rate, it's completely the opposite, with migration being one of the largest migrant-sending countries in the MENA region. And for instance, the very recent estimates from the World Bank showed that Egypt is the 5th country in the world to receive remittances. So this new wave of the ELMPS allows us to look at both internal and international migration, and what we try to do in this paper is look more precisely in what were the trends and the patterns of migration since the Arab Spring. So there was a lot of discussion on migration, especially on the part of receiving countries and the waves of migration coming from Europe. We saw a spike in migration from Egypt, especially in Italy. So we tried to see a little bit what might have changed. So first of all, a few definitions. When we look at internal migrants, in the literature, we usually look at individuals who changed their location between the place of birth and the current location. But then, using the retrospective data in the ELMPS, we define as internal migrants all the individuals who changed their location of residence and their concentration compared to the previous location of residence to the previous waves. Also, retrospectively, when they declared it, they have changed their location. So this allows us to compute mobility between the regions of Egypt, between governorates, also between cities, towns, and villages. And then we also try to compute that by the decades of migration to see a little bit how this might have changed over time. And then, when we analyze it, we have an alternative definition that is just based on the place of birth. So we say that an internal migrant is that person who, at the time of the survey, is living in a different place from there where he was born. And then for international migration, we adopt, of course, the standard definition, but I just wanted to flag out that we will be using the term international migration to refer both at return migrants and at current migrants. The return migrants, we have specific information about them in the survey, where people are asked whether they have lived or worked abroad for more than 6 months. And the current migrants, this is information that we get from surveying the remaining household. So I would say this is second-hand information. That's why this part we will use it a bit, put more care, I would say. So what do we know from the ELMPS 2018 on internal migration? First of all, what we see is that only 9% of individuals declare that they have moved from their place of birth in 2018. Of course, if we restrict this definition to people who are 15 or over 15, the percentage goes up to 12%, but still it's quite a low number compared to, as I was saying, around 15% for the other countries in the region. And as you can see as well, this migration has been decreasing, and here we just focus on rural to urban migration, which is the type of migration which is, I would say, is most talked about when we talk about internal migration. And we can see that even rural to urban migration is decreasing. The reason why this is important is linked to urbanization, and we know that urbanization is a very important phenomena in development. So in general, middle and low-income countries, they tend to experience an increasing or accelerating urbanization and rural exodus. What we see in Egypt is that we actually have a quite low migration rate from rural to urban regions, and actually migration from urban to rural, it's more or less the same as urban to urban. So people tend to stay more or less where they are born. Now, which is the typical profile of internal migrants? Of course, most of them are male, they're middle-aged, so we have an average of around 40 years old. Most of them are married. And what's interesting is that compared to 2012, we can see that internal migrants are increasingly those who have a secondary education. Slightly over a third of them actually work in the public sector, and this is a decrease from 2012, but it's mostly probably due to the decrease in employment in public sector. And interesting, more and more of them actually work in agriculture. I think this has to be linked also to the results of the other papers, where we see that there is a decrease in the agricultural jobs. So probably the fact that more and more internal migrants are those working in agriculture, compared, for instance, we have 22% in 2018, whereas we had only 15% in 2012, it may also be linked to the lack of opportunities in the sector. We thought a little bit to see what could explain this low migration, and we thought maybe it has to do with commuting. Maybe people just migrate less because they commute more. And we tried to look at that by education level, because of course one would expect for commuting and migration rates to vary across education levels. And as you can see, when we compare 2012 and 2018, we do not actually find a significant difference in commuting rates. Of course, as one might expect, we have a slightly lower rates for commuting for higher education levels, but they're almost all around 60–70%. Now, we turn to international migration to see what the picture is regarding international migration, and then see how we can link the two. So, in terms of international migration, when we look both at return migration and current international migration, we can see that 9% of the entire working age population has had an international migration experience. And if we compare 2012 and 2018, we can see that there was a slight drop in international migration, either the current one or the returnees, that rates have slightly decreased. Now, of course, we know that generally higher educated people tend to migrate more. This has not always been the case depending on the countries. So when we look at Egypt, we are trying to see whether this decrease, we can also link it to education. So maybe migration did decrease, but not for all education levels. And this is a little bit what we see, because as you can see, people having less education, no education, or primary and preparatory education have seen their migration rate decrease, while those having above secondary education, actually we see a very slight increase in the migration rate. So the recent decrease in migration is actually mostly due to those, well, mainly concerns those who are less educated. Now, the typical profile of international migrants, again, mostly young men. Almost half of them have secondary education, and what we also see is that more and more tertiary educated individuals tend to migrate compared to before. Interestingly, most of them were working before migrating. So migration, it's not just a sort of way out of unemployment, it can also be a way out of irregular employment, and an alternative to I would say, a more vulnerable position on the labor market. It's also interesting that we have a high increase in the share of regular wage workers in migration. So more and more people, even though they have a regular wage, that does not mean that they are formal or covered, as I was saying, but then even they are migrating more and more compared to 2012. So this might also reflect a deterioration in the conditions of the labor market. And almost all of them, so 93% of them, were working in the private sector and mostly in the informal sector. So it's interesting to link these to the findings on the vulnerability and on the deterioration of the conditions of wages, but also of coverage of informality and job satisfaction. Now, when we look at destination countries, we see that there was a slight change in the ranks of these countries. So in 2012, we had a high share of current migrants, for instance. Most of them were going to Saudi Arabia, and this is more or less the same. In 2018, this percentage has only fallen by 2 percentage points, but where we do see a huge decrease is in the share of migrants that were going to Libya, for instance, and then we find more of them going to Kuwait and even to other OECD countries, and they're less going to the EU countries. So we can see that the decrease in international migration that we see in the overall numbers can be linked to both the worsening of conditions in Libya, but also to more restrictive migration policies in Europe, because these are the two main destination countries where we see changes. Now, what does this tell us about remittances? And of course, when we look at the level of remittances that households received from their members abroad, we see that the fall in migration flows, stocks, is reflected also in the fall in remittances. And if 5.2% of households were receiving remittances in 2012, this percentage has fallen to only 3.2%. Now, what we see in the literature is that sometimes internal migration might be a first step towards international migration. In other contexts, it's the opposite. We see international migration as being an alternative to internal migration. So we're interested to see a little bit which could be the relationship between the two types of migration in Egypt, and whether this high international migration rate might explain in part the very low internal migration rate. This is quite exploratory work, and we know that we still need to dwell a little bit more on the results. But first of all, what we're trying to see is whether the decrease in both internal migration and international migration was the same for across education levels, and to see maybe if the decrease that we see in low educated individuals might have a link with internal migration. And what we actually see is that we had this decrease throughout all the education level. All the migration rates actually decreased. And if we just look at whether an individual engages in international migration or just in internal migration or in both, to just see whether one person that has had an international migration experience, if he has also moved his location, if maybe someone moved from a rural village to a city, and then this actually triggered or allowed him to have the funds to go internationally, and therefore we could imagine that there was a sort of complementarity between internal migration that facilitated international migration, or if people choose to either migrate internationally or migrate internally. And what we can see is that actually very few individuals engage in both types of migrations. We have only 0.9% and 26.4% of individuals that both had an international migration experience and an internal migration experience in 2012 and 2018. So we can see that if we try to match international and internal migration, we tend to have quite different populations. And I didn't put here the graph, but we also did this for households, because this can also be a household strategy to send either international or internal migration. And we see that it's quite different. So we have very different individuals who migrate internally and others who migrate internationally. And it might be that individuals just make a sort of rational decision that they would migrate internationally, as there are so many, I would say, opportunities or available positions internationally to Egyptians, and this might be an alternative to an internal migration. So what do we find here is that the internal migration in Egypt are still very low, and actually we see that the share of the urban population is more or less the same for the last 50 years, which is quite surprising for a country similar to the same level of income for to Egypt. That there was a decrease in international migration rates and in return migration rates. So this decrease is probably explained by the restrictive migration policies that have been implemented progressively in Europe, but also by the worsening situation in other countries where there was a huge Egyptian migration, such as Libya. It can also be linked to the relatively low oil prices and the nationalization policies in the Gulf countries. We tend to show that individuals typically engage in only one type of migration, so mostly either in international or internal migration. And we see that we have more or less the same percentage for both types of migration, and that it's probably this decrease in international migration that might be responsible, I would say, for also the low migration in Egypt. We're expecting actually to see that if international migration decreases over the next years, we might see maybe an increase in internal migration in Egypt as a repercussion, but we are not yet sure that we'll be able to see that. So this is it.